December 10th, 1925. Fifth Avenue, New York City. The temperature has dropped to 19 degrees, and inside a mansion worth $4 million, the man who taught America to inhale is taking his final breath. The limestone fortress rises from the winter haze like a monument to permanence, its Carrara marble steps glazed with ice that catches the amber glow of street lamps. Inside these walls, beyond mahogany doors thick enough to muffle the world's chaos, the empire of smoke is quietly ending. The wind howling down Fifth Avenue carries the bite of winter, but it cannot penetrate the sanctuary James Buchanan Duke built to keep mortality at bay. Tonight, however, the fortress has been breached. The enemy was already inside, lodged deep in lungs that spent 68 years breathing the very product that funded this palace of gilt and marble. In the master suite, the air hangs heavy with the scent of camphor, stale linen, and something else, the persistent molecular presence of tobacco that has seeped into every fiber, every thread, every pore of this mansion. It clings to the silk damask wallpaper, the Persian rugs worth more than most Americans earn in a lifetime, the oil paintings of romanticized southern plantations that line the walls. James Buchanan Duke lies propped against a mountain of monogrammed pillows, his massive frame, once the broad, intimidating presence that stared down Supreme Court justices and crushed competitors, now diminished translucent skin stretched over bones that seem suddenly fragile. His hands, scarred and calloused from a boyhood spent in North Carolina's red clay, pick aimlessly at silk coverlets. These are the hands that signed the papers creating the most ruthless monopoly the Gilded Age had ever witnessed, the hands that built universities and cathedrals, the hands that held America's nervous system in their grip. Now they tremble with a weakness that no amount of capital can cure. 3 physicians hover in the shadows, their starched collars and black coats a stark contrast to the warm opulence surrounding them. They adjust valves on oxygen tanks and murmur in professional Latin, performing the ceremonial theater of medicine for a patient who is moved beyond their expertise. They are the finest doctors money can summon, specialists from Johns Hopkins, Harvard, the Mayo Clinic, practicing in hospitals that, in many cases, this dying man's donations helped build. The irony glows with devastating clarity. The man gasping for air is surrounded by symbols of permanence, heavy bronze sculptures, and crystal decanters that will outlive him by centuries. While his fortune, vast enough to reshape entire states, cannot purchase another breath. On the nightstand, resting on Italian marble, sits the evening's most eloquent witness, a silver cigarette case exquisitely crafted, engraved with sapphires spelling out his initials JBD. It remains conspicuously unopened. For 40 years, this case was his constant companion, refilled daily with the perfectly rolled white cylinders his factories perfected. He smoked with the voracious appetite of a conqueror, consuming his own inventory as if to prove its safety to a skeptical world. He inhaled the profits of curing barns, the dust of factory floors, the burning leaves of his own creation. Now his lungs, ravaged by pneumonia and weakened by decades of industrial exposure, are drowning in fluid. The very mechanism of his rise has become the instrument of his fall. Dominion has deserted its master. The scope of what is vanishing tonight defies ordinary comprehension. By this December evening, the machinery set in motion by James Duke has produced over 100 billion cigarettes. His empire, though legally shattered by the Supreme Court in 1911, continues through its offspring, R.J. Reynolds, Liggett and Myers, Lorillard, a reconstituted American tobacco company. Every fragment bears his fingerprints, employs his techniques, profits from the infrastructure he built. More than a quarter of American adults now smoke daily, a habit that barely existed when he entered the tobacco business in the 1870s. He did not invent the cigarette, but he invented the cigarette industry. He transformed tobacco from agriculture into engineering, from product into compulsion, from choice into craving. Outside the heavy velvet drapes, New York City pulses with the frenetic energy of the Roaring '20s, a world James Duke helped create. Down on the frozen streets, young men in raccoon coats and women in fashionable hats pause to light cigarettes against the December cold. They strike matches with gloved hands, cupping flames against the wind, inhaling the sharp bite of mass-produced tobacco. They are the children of his marketing genius, a generation addicted not just to nicotine, but to the image of sophistication he manufactured. He sold them more than a product, he sold them a feeling, a gesture of rebellion, a breath of cool confidence. In exchange, they gave him their health and their pennies, millions upon millions stacking up to build the roof under which he now dies. They smoke his cigarettes, not literally, for the monopoly was broken, but spiritually, consuming the legacy of his industrial alchemy. They do not know that the architect of their habit is expiring just stories above their heads. As midnight approaches, Duke's daughter Doris waits in another wing of the mansion, shielded from the rattling death echoing through these opulent corridors. His wife Nanaline paces in an adjoining room, her composure fracturing with each labored breath that penetrates the walls. But Duke himself remains conscious, his mind sharp even as his body surrenders. Perhaps he calculates, even now, the dividends his estate will generate, the trusts that will bear his name, the university that will transform his reputation from robber baron to benefactor. Or perhaps he simply confronts the equation he spent a lifetime denying, that wealth is temporary, but the damage he engineered will outlive him by generations. He spent his final decade frantically laundering his legacy, pouring millions into the Duke endowment, transforming blood money into holy water. He built hospitals to heal bodies his products would eventually break, orphanages and churches to wrap his reputation in philanthropy's protective cloak. He commissioned marble angels and stained glass windows, buying immortality one monument at a time. But death remains the one monopoly he cannot acquire, the one trust he cannot break. He would be remembered as a philanthropist, a builder of universities, a patron saint of progress. But before the marble monuments and stained glass windows, James Buchanan Duke accomplished something far more sinister. He learned how to manufacture craving itself. And in doing so, he built the most ruthless monopoly the Gilded Age had ever witnessed. To understand how a farmer's son from the ashes of the Confederacy could engineer a nation's addiction, we must return to the red clay of North Carolina, where the soil was poor, but the hunger for dominion was bottomless. Washington Duke walks the final miles of a 130-mile journey home from a Union prison camp, his boots worn through to the sole, his body hollowed by months of captivity, his pockets containing nothing but worthless Confederate script, and the bitter knowledge that everything he fought to preserve has been incinerated. The war ended not with trumpets and glory, but with the slow, grinding collapse of a civilization built on illusion. The air still carries the acrid scent of charred timber and defeat. Rail lines lie twisted like broken ribs across the Carolina landscape, their steel arteries severed and useless. Courthouses stand gutted by fire, their records of property and debt reduced to ash that dances on the winter wind. This is not the romantic devastation of literature, but the grinding, soul-crushing reality of total economic collapse, a world where the currency of an entire nation has become decorative paper, where the social order has been dissolved not by philosophy, but by arithmetic. He returns to find his modest farm near Durham, stripped bare by the mathematics of war. The house still stands, but barely. Its roof leaks, its fences sag under their own weight, and the fields lie choked with weeds that flourish in the absence of human ambition. The few slaves who once worked his modest acreage have vanished into the chaos of emancipation, leaving him not only without labor, but without the familiar rhythms that once structured his days. His life savings, meticulously hoarded in Confederate currency, now mock him from a tin box beneath loose floorboards, elaborate engravings on paper from a government that exists only in memory. At 45 years old, Washington Duke confronts the arithmetic of total defeat: no labor, no capital, no future that resembles the past, and 50 cents in silver coin representing the sum total of his liquid assets. But he has 2 sons waiting in that weathered farmhouse. Benjamin the elder possesses his father's practical stoicism and willingness to endure whatever hardships necessity demands. And then there is James, 9 years old, rail-thin from wartime hunger, with eyes that absorb everything and reveal nothing. The boy who watches his father survey the wreckage does not possess the soft, sheltered gaze of childhood, but the hardened, calculating look of a survivor who has already learned that the world can erase a man's life work with the stroke of a pen or the collapse of a currency. Young James Duke is receiving an education no schoolhouse could provide, learning lessons that will echo through American capitalism for generations. Washington Duke discovers one asset that survived Sherman's march and the war's devastation: bright leaf tobacco still grows in the red clay despite the scorched earth around it. This is not the refined, aristocratic tobacco of Virginia plantations, not the perfumed leaf that once filled the pipes of Southern gentlemen in their columned mansions. This is survival tobacco, coarse and strong, the kind that burns the throat and stains the fingers yellow. It is harsh, unforgiving, and utterly without pretension. But it grows. And in 1865, anything that grows represents hope, however bitter that hope might taste. The Duke family begins with less than nothing, for poverty in the post-war South carries not merely the absence of wealth, but the presence of public humiliation. They live in a house with gaps between floorboards wide enough to see the dirt below. Young James sleeps on a corn shuck mattress and wakes before dawn to work fields that yield barely enough to justify the back-breaking labor. With no mules left to pull a plow, the animals long since requisitioned by one army or another, father and sons hitch themselves to the harness, reducing themselves to beasts of burden as they drag the blade through stubborn earth. They beat tobacco with wooden flails, sift it by hand through crude screens, and pack it into rough burlap sacks, stamped with the family name in fading ink. For young James Duke, these years of destitution become his true schooling, more valuable than any formal education the ruined South could have provided. He absorbs 3 brutal lessons that no gentleman's academy could teach, lessons that will harden into the core principles of his future empire. First, poverty is not a noble struggle that builds character, as the sermons suggest, but a trap that strips dignity before it strips food. There is nothing romantic about creditors arriving in Sunday clothes to measure your furniture with their eyes, nothing ennobling about not knowing how you will repay what you owe. He watches his father's shoulders bend under the weight of debt and resolves, with cold and quiet fury, that he will never again live at the mercy of other men's decisions. Second, the South lost the war, but retained something more valuable than its tattered battle flags. It still possessed the land, the agricultural knowledge, and most crucially, the desperate hunger that could be organized into profit. The old slave economy had shattered, but the instinct to extract maximum value from human labor, whether black or white, remained intact, simply adopting new costumes and more subtle chains. Third, and most crucially, if you can control what people crave, you can control everything that follows. He watches his father peddle tobacco to Union soldiers, former Confederates, anyone with coins to spare, and notices how men will scrape together their last copper for a pinch of relief. They arrive claiming poverty, yet somehow coins materialize from secret pockets when the craving demands satisfaction. Comfort may be a luxury, but craving is a necessity, and necessity never negotiates. The Dukes load their meager harvest into a mule-drawn wagon and set off across the ravaged countryside, sleeping under stars, haggling for pennies in dusty general stores and country crossroads. James absorbs the subtle mechanics of commerce during these journeys, which merchants pay promptly, which customers return most often, how his father adjusts prices based on desperation rather than cost, the way certain men's hands shake when they haven't had tobacco for days. These observations, nearly invisible to adults weary from survival, etch themselves into the mind of a boy who will grow into something far more formidable than a farmer. He learns to read faces, to calculate the difference between want and need, to recognize the precise moment when negotiation becomes capitulation. By the late 1870s, Durham begins to transform around them, rising from Confederate ashes like a phoenix built on tobacco and relentless ambition. The railroads creep back into service, steel rails laid cautiously across the scorched landscape, reconnecting isolated markets to distant cities hungry for Southern products. Tobacco warehouses flicker back to life near the depot, their vast interiors filling with bales of cured leaf. Men who once fired rifles now fire curing barns, turning green leaves into golden currency. The Dukes recognize that the era of lone farmers and burlap sacks is ending. Industry is arriving, not with fanfare, but with contracts and machinery, capital and the promise of scale. With ruthless frugality that borders on self-denial, Washington and his sons scrape together capital from every conceivable source. They borrow against future crops, barter labor for materials, defer payments until creditors grow impatient, and squeeze their modest operation into something just large enough to be called a factory. It is a generous description for what they build, a plain two-story structure of timber and brick in Durham, smelling of sweat, tobacco dust, and naked ambition. The building lacks elegance but possesses something more valuable: efficiency. They christen this venture with a Latin name that drips with calculated irony: pro bono publico. For the public good. The phrase is chosen to impress, to drape noble purpose over pure profit motive, to suggest civic virtue where only commercial hunger exists. Nothing about the coming dynasty will serve the public good. It will serve only control. Inside this modest facility, workers, mostly local men and women paid barely enough to return the next morning, hand-roll cigarettes and pack loose tobacco into pouches. The work is monotonous, the margins thin, and the product itself perched on the fringe of respectability. The tobacco industry of the 1880s remains a gentleman's game, fragmented among dozens of small manufacturers who compete within understood limits and unspoken agreements. Cigars, thick and fragrant, dominate among men who fancy themselves important, requiring time and ritual to consume properly. Chewing tobacco and snuff control the working classes, products that speak to established habits and regional loyalties. Cigarettes are regarded as suspiciously foreign, effeminate, unserious, a European affectation unsuited to robust American masculinity, paper-wrapped sins that lack the substantial weight of a proper cigar. This genteel competition operates on assumptions that have remained unchanged for decades. Hand-rolling produces superior cigarettes, quality matters more than quantity, and customers remain loyal to established regional brands built on personal relationships and local reputation. A skilled worker can produce perhaps 3 cigarettes per minute, maybe 2,000 per day if exceptionally fast, and willing to sacrifice precision for speed. Labor costs real money. Capacity remains stubbornly finite. This natural ceiling creates a fragile equilibrium that feels permanent to those profiting from it, a comfortable world where everyone understands their place and respects territorial boundaries. James Duke, now a young man with the restless energy of a predator, does not share that comfortable illusion. By his 20th birthday, he has internalized the essential truth of Gilded Age capitalism. Sentiment is a luxury the poor cannot afford, and mercy is what the weak call fairness. He studies the industry's comfortable boundaries, with the cold precision of a military strategist surveying enemy positions. Where others see respectability and tradition, he sees inefficiency and structural vulnerability waiting to be exploited by someone willing to abandon the industry's aristocratic pretensions. He travels, first across the South, then to northern cities, observing how industry behaves when liberated from tradition's constraints, watching investors discuss railroads, oil, and steel as if they were empires rather than mere enterprises. He realizes that the true aristocrats of the new America are not born into land, but forge their rank through control of production, distribution, and human desire itself. In an industry that still believed in handcrafted tradition and gentlemanly rivalry, James B. Duke envisioned something revolutionary, a future where one man could control not just a product, but the very rhythm of a nation's nervous system. All he needed was a machine that could roll faster than human hands, and a public that would never be satisfied. The machine stood in Bonsack's Virginia workshop like an industrial altar, all gleaming brass gears and leather belts, a mechanical prophet announcing the death of human craftsmanship. It was 15 feet of precision engineering that did not roar or blaze, but did something far more unsettling, it repeated. Day after day, hour after hour, it repeated the same mechanical gesture with inhuman patience no worker could match. Thin paper, a stream of shredded tobacco, a roll, a cut, a drop. Again. 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 The contraption clicked and whirred with the rhythmic certainty of a heartbeat, each rotation producing 4 cigarettes where human hands could produce one. It did not tire. It did not demand wages. It did not organize into unions or complain about conditions. It simply consumed raw materials and expelled finished products with the cold indifference of pure mechanism. In an age still entranced by the mythology of the craftsman and the sanctity of the handmaid, the Bonsack machine appeared almost indecent. The established tobacco manufacturers, aristocrats of industry who had inherited their businesses from fathers and grandfathers, examined it with a blend of curiosity and distaste, like gentlemen observing a crude but powerful animal. They ran their fingers along its iron frame, watched it spew cigarettes with unnerving regularity, and all reached the same conclusion. It was dangerous, but not in the way it would later prove to be. They believed it threatened quality, not civilization itself. Too expensive, they said, calculating the initial investment against their comfortable profit margins. Too unreliable, they warned, pointing to early prototypes that jammed and tore delicate paper. Too radical, they concluded, unwilling to abandon the romantic notion that quality required the human touch, that customers could taste the difference between hand-rolled tradition and machine-made uniformity. These men trusted what had always been. They trusted their skilled workers, mostly men with long experience and quiet pride who produced perhaps 200, maybe 300 cigarettes per day. Those workers had names, families, grievances, and generations of accumulated knowledge. The machine had none. Every major tobacco company in America rejected the Bonsack machine. Every company except one. When James Buchanan Duke first saw the contraption, he did not see imperfection or threat to tradition. He saw inevitability. While others focused on the flaws, he counted the ratios and understood something his competitors could not grasp. Mediocrity at massive scale often defeats excellence at limited scale. Standing before the clattering beast, watching the continuous white stream of tobacco emerge from its metal jaws, Duke recognized that this machine was not merely a tool for efficiency, it was a weapon of economic annihilation. The machine was clumsy, yes, but clumsiness could be refined. Human nature could not. Perfection was not his goal, dominion was. Duke approached Bonsack's representatives with an audacity that would become his signature throughout his career. He offered something no other firm would: volume and absolute commitment. He agreed to make the machine the beating heart of his entire operation, to base his family's future on unproven technology. In exchange, he demanded something of almost unthinkable strategic importance: steep discounts on royalties for every cigarette the machine produced, and de facto exclusivity in its use. The agreement, finalized in 1885, reads like a minor business arrangement, but functioned as an instrument of economic warfare. For every 1,000 cigarettes rolled by a Bonsack machine in Duke's factories, he paid significantly less than any rival who dared adopt the same technology. Duke hired mechanics to live at his Durham factory, sleeping on cots beside the machines, waking at all hours to fix jammed gears and torn paper. He obsessed over the devices, learning their rhythms, their flaws, their potential, treating them not as equipment but as weapons in a war his competitors didn't yet realize they were fighting. Within 2 years, the gamble paid off spectacularly. Duke's production costs plummeted by roughly 90%. Where his competitors relied on human hands tied to human limits, Duke's factories became the domain of iron and steam, producing cigarettes at prices that seemed suicidal to traditional manufacturers. But as Duke's factories roared to life, belching out unprecedented quantities of white cylinders, he confronted a second, more fundamental problem. He had built an ocean of supply in a world that still consumed cigarettes by the cupful. Americans were not yet smoking in the quantities his machinery demanded. Cigarettes remained a niche product, regarded with suspicion by a nation that preferred cigars, pipes, and chewing tobacco. They were seen as foreign, effeminate, unserious, a European affectation unsuited to robust American masculinity. Duke possessed the capacity to flood the market, but the market itself barely existed. Where others would have slowed expansion, Duke accelerated something else entirely: imagination. If existing appetites were insufficient, he would create new ones. If the market did not yet crave his product, he would teach it how. His solution was revolutionary not only for tobacco but for capitalism itself. James Duke did not simply sell cigarettes. He sold stories, fantasies, and most crucially, the manufacturing of desire itself. He invented modern advertising long before the term became fashionable, understanding instinctively what behavioral psychologists would only articulate decades later: people will return to whatever gives them small, repeatable rewards. Each pack of his cigarettes became a delivery system not just for nicotine, but for fantasy, glamour, and aspiration. He commissioned artists and printers to produce colorful collectible cards, images of baseball players, actresses in provocative poses, military heroes, exotic animals, and foreign scenes, tiny windows into worlds most Americans would never see. These cards, inserted into every pack, turned each purchase into the beginning of a collection, the start of an obsession that had nothing to do with tobacco and everything to do with human psychology. Children traded them with obsessive fervor. Mothers bought more packs to complete sets. Bartenders pinned them behind counters. Shopkeepers displayed them near registers. The cigarette was no longer a solitary product. It was the key to a growing universe of ownership and desire. Suddenly, a pack of cigarettes was more than a smoke. It was a treasure chest, a lottery ticket, a promise of discovery. The urge to collect, to complete the set, drove sales as much as nicotine itself. He plastered cities with posters and billboards bearing slogans carefully composed to redefine the cigarette in the American mind. Duke's Cigarettes, the Gentleman's Choice, read one in dignified script above a sketch of a refined man, elegantly dressed, exhaling smoke that appeared less like pollution and more like a symbol of leisure and sophistication. Another campaign shattered Victorian taboos by targeting women: a cigarette for the modern lady, featuring a fashionable figure with gloved hands and a confident gaze, suggesting that smoking represented freedom from constraint, a gesture of independence that modern women could embrace. Most cynically and effectively, he targeted the vulnerable with a ruthlessness masked as generosity. Duke understood that war forges habits that peace rarely breaks, that boredom and stress create psychological vulnerabilities that nicotine can exploit. He distributed free cigarettes to Union veterans, to soldiers stationed at posts across the expanding nation, to factory workers during shift changes, to young men gathered outside theaters and sporting events. He stood outside immigration centers in New York, handing packs to men fresh off boats, ensuring that their first taste of America included the taste of bright leaf tobacco. The samples were an investment. The addiction was the return. The mathematics of dependency began to assert themselves with brutal efficiency. With production costs stripped to the bone, Duke could afford to sell cheaply, making cigarettes accessible to those who once considered them extravagant. He dropped the price to 5 cents per pack, suddenly making the cigarette the most affordable luxury in America. Immigrants crowding into urban tenements, factory workers earning subsistence wages, young men desperate to appear sophisticated, all could now purchase a piece of the image he had manufactured. Each cigarette delivered a precise dose of nicotine, that elegant alkaloid that rewires the brain's reward pathways with chemical precision. More cigarettes meant more nicotine absorbed, more bodies quietly binding themselves to his expanding fortune. The impact was seismic and swift. In 1880, Americans smoked roughly 500 million cigarettes annually. By 1890, largely due to Duke's relentless industrial and psychological assault, that number exploded to over 2 billion, a 400% increase that represented the transformation of an entire nation's nervous system. The landscape of American leisure was changing. The spittoon began to disappear, replaced by the ashtray. The slow ritual of the pipe was replaced by the quick, frantic fix of the cigarette, a habit perfectly suited for the accelerating pace of modern industrial life, a drug for the machine age delivered by the machine king. Duke's competitors watched in horror as their world collapsed around them. They had laughed at the Bonsack machine. Now it was burying them. Their hand rollers couldn't keep up with mechanical precision. Their prices couldn't compete with mass production. Their brands were being drowned out by the cacophony of Duke's advertising. Old established family firms in Virginia and New York saw their market share evaporate like smoke. They tried to fight back, launching their own cards, cutting their own prices, but they were bleeding cash while Duke was printing it. He had achieved the capitalist dream, lowering the cost of production while simultaneously expanding the market, winning on both ends of the equation. Duke began to squeeze with predatory precision. He used his massive war chest to launch price wars in specific regions, selling cigarettes at a loss just long enough to bankrupt local rivals. He bought up suppliers of foil and paper, choking off competitors' raw materials. He was relentless, unsentimental, and brutally effective, proving that in the new American economy, the man with the best machine and the fewest scruples would always triumph. By 1890, the numbers confirmed what instinct had whispered to him years earlier. James Duke controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. For any ordinary businessman, such dominance would have signaled victory, a triumph worthy of celebration and contentment. For Duke, it was merely proof of concept, a reassuring but insufficient foothold on the cliff face of potential power. 40% meant that 60% remained beyond his command, that money was still flowing into other men's pockets, that variables existed beyond his control. And James B. Duke was not interested in shares or partnerships or gentlemanly competition. He was interested in total dominion. The chaotic nature of competition offended him like a mathematical error that demanded correction. He didn't want to be the biggest fish in the pond. He wanted to drain the pond and own the water itself. By 1890, James Duke controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. But 40% was not enough. He wanted total dominion. And so, in a smoke-filled boardroom in Manhattan, he summoned his rivals to a meeting that would transform American capitalism forever. January 1890. Manhattan. James Duke invited his 4 largest competitors to a private meeting. The message was elegantly simple: join me, or I will annihilate you. The boardroom occupied the 11th floor of a limestone fortress on Lower Broadway, high enough that the chaos of the street became a distant murmur. insulated enough that what transpired within these walls would remain secret until the consequences became unavoidable. Heavy velvet drapes blocked the winter light, forcing the room to exist in the amber glow of gas lamps that hissed softly above cut crystal decanters. The air hung thick with cigar smoke, expensive cigars, the kind that cost more than a factory worker earned in a week, and underneath that blue haze, the sharper scent of fear disguised as bravado. At the center of the room stood a mahogany table so massive it had required 16 men to carry it up the stairs, its surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected the faces of the men gathered around it like a pool of dark water. The men who entered that paneled sanctuary were not weaklings or amateurs. They represented the established aristocracy of American tobacco, Allen and Ginter of Richmond, with their elegant cigarette cards and Virginia refinement, Kinney Tobacco Company, masters of the urban market, W.T. Blackwell and Company, whose Bull Durham brand had become synonymous with quality, and William S. Kimball and Company, whose Vanity Fair cigarettes commanded premium prices among discerning smokers. These were dynasties built over decades, firms that had survived the Civil War, weathered economic panics, and built reputations on craftsmanship and regional loyalty. They arrived wrapped in wool overcoats and dignity, escorted by lawyers who spoke the language of contracts and caution, believing they were attending a negotiation among equals. What they encountered instead was a masterclass in economic hostage-taking. James Buchanan Duke sat at the head of the table with the cold gravity of a monarch receiving tribute. At 33, he possessed an unsettling combination of youthful energy and ancient ruthlessness, his pale eyes calculating odds, while his soft southern drawl delivered ultimatums. He did not waste time with the performative courtesy that gentlemen of commerce typically exchanged. Instead, he laid out his terms with the precision of a surgeon describing an amputation. They would merge their companies into a single entity to be called the American Tobacco Company. Resources would be pooled, prices would be fixed, competition would be eliminated, and profits would be divided according to a formula Duke had already calculated to his advantage. The alternative, he explained with a smile that never reached his eyes, was systematic annihilation. Duke supported his threat with arithmetic that cut through their dignity like acid through silk. He displayed production figures, cost comparisons, market penetration data, the cold mathematics of industrial warfare. His Bonsack machines could produce cigarettes for a fraction of their costs. His factories operated with relentless efficiency, while theirs remained shackled to human limitations. He could flood any market with cheaper products, sustain losses that would bankrupt them, and emerge victorious from price wars that would leave their family businesses as historical footnotes. This was not negotiation. It was the offering of terms to the defeated before the final battle had even been fought. One by one they signed, some with visible anger, their hands trembling as they put pen to paper, others with resignation, recognizing that Duke had already won, and that resistance would only determine how much they lost in the process. Pride can withstand insult and rivalry, but not bankruptcy. By the end of that winter afternoon, the American Tobacco Company had been born, a leviathan that would reshape not just tobacco, but the entire architecture of American capitalism. The immediate results were staggering. Within months, the trust controlled 90% of American cigarette production. But for James Duke, 90% was merely proof of concept, a reassuring but insufficient foothold on the cliff face of total dominion. His hunger for control was fractal. The more he consumed, the more detail he saw in what remained to be conquered. The trust's tentacles reached out like a hydra, swallowing the snuff market, then chewing tobacco, then the stubborn, fragmented world of cigars. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: identify the largest players, offer merger or destruction, absorb the compliant, crush the resistant. Duke deployed a tactical arsenal that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. This was capitalism weaponized, refined into instruments of commercial cruelty that operated with surgical precision. Predatory pricing became his favorite blunt instrument. When an independent competitor dared to rise in a specific region, Duke would flood that market with his own fighting brands. Cigarettes sold at a fraction of their production cost, sometimes virtually given away. The local manufacturer, unable to match the trust's limitless war chest, would bleed cash until bankruptcy became inevitable. Once the rival was buried, Duke would quietly raise prices again, recouping his losses from consumers who now had nowhere else to turn. But price wars were only one weapon in an arsenal of systematic oppression. Duke created a network of industrial espionage that rivaled the intelligence services of sovereign nations. He planted spies in competitors' factories to steal formulas and manufacturing techniques. He bribed railway clerks to leak shipping manifests, allowing him to intercept competitors' products before they reached market. He stationed agents in warehouses and counting houses, men whose only job was to track which retailers gave shelf space to rival brands. Laws offered few clear prohibitions against such tactics, and when they did exist, Duke's lawyers, brilliant and well-compensated, could cloud any accusation in a fog of technicalities and procedural delays. The consignment system became Duke's most insidious innovation. Retailers who wanted to stock the trust's popular brands, the cigarettes customers actually demanded, were forced to sign exclusive contracts forbidding them from carrying competitors' products. It was elegant in its simplicity. Duke used consumer preference as a weapon, forcing shopkeepers to choose between his complete product line or no access to his brands at all. Those who defied the trust found their supply chains mysteriously severed, their credit lines frozen by banks that had quietly come under Duke's influence, their businesses strangled by an invisible hand that left no fingerprints. The human cost of this empire building radiated far beyond boardrooms and courtrooms. In the tobacco fields of Kentucky and Tennessee, the so-called Black Patch region, farmers discovered that their world had been transformed into a landscape of quiet desperation. The old auction system, where buyers competed and farmers received fair market value, vanished overnight. Duke's agents arrived with a single, non-negotiable price: take it or watch your crop rot in the barn. There were no other buyers because Duke had absorbed them all. The mathematics were brutal and simple. With monopoly control over purchasing, the trust could dictate terms rather than negotiate them. Men who had spent generations working the same soil, who had survived the Civil War and Reconstruction, now found themselves one bad season away from foreclosure. They watched their children go hungry while Duke's fortune multiplied exponentially, saw their land slip into the hands of banks that answered to distant masters in New York. The psychological toll was devastating. These were men who had defined themselves as independent yeoman farmers, and Duke's system reduced them to sharecroppers in all but name. As his empire expanded, Duke himself underwent a metamorphosis that seemed to occur at the cellular level. The scrappy, hungry boy from Durham's red clay vanished, replaced by something resembling an American emperor. He moved his headquarters to New York City, insulating himself in layers of marble and mahogany. He began dressing in bespoke suits tailored on Savile Row, joined exclusive clubs that once would have rejected a Southern tobacco farmer's son, and purchased private railroad cars fitted with crystal chandeliers and Persian carpets. He acquired mansions in Manhattan and Newport, yachts that rivaled those of Vanderbilt and Astor, art collections that museums envied. Yet beneath the polished veneer, his private correspondence reveals a man driven not by satisfaction, but by an inexhaustible grievance against the world. He slept little, often working past midnight in offices where ledgers and telegrams piled like evidence of obsession. He was contemptuous of those he regarded as weak, which included nearly everyone, and his letters drip with disdain for competitors who lacked his appetite for total control. He tracked numbers with fanatical precision, demanding daily reports on production, sales, and market share from every corner of his empire, treating business not as a means to wealth, but as a form of warfare where the objective was not profit but the complete annihilation of all opposition. But pressure builds where compression is applied, and by 1904, the American countryside began to buckle under the weight of Duke's monopoly. In the tobacco fields of Kentucky and Tennessee, desperation curdled into something far more dangerous: organized violence. The Black Patch Tobacco Wars erupted like a peasant revolt in the heart of industrial America, a primal scream against the invisible economic forces that were grinding entire communities into dust. Desperate farmers, watching their way of life disappear while Duke built palaces, formed secret societies with names that belonged in revolutionary manifestos. The Night Riders, the Silent Brigade, the Possum Hunters. Under cover of darkness, thousands of masked men rode out to reclaim their dignity with fire and the whip. They burned the barns of farmers who dared sell to the trust, dynamited warehouses where Duke stored his stolen harvest, and dragged trust sympathizers from their beds to administer brutal whippings by torchlight. Towns woke to find tobacco warehouses reduced to ash, their owners beaten and warned that cooperation with the trust meant death. The violence escalated through 1907 and 1908, spreading across counties like wildfire. The night sky over Kentucky glowed orange with burning tobacco, a violent signal that the emperor's grip was slipping. These were not professional revolutionaries, but desperate men driven to extremes by a system that offered them no peaceful path to survival. They imposed their own brutal order in a landscape where the law seemed uninterested in protecting the weak from corporate leverage. Duke's response was characteristically ruthless and systematic. He hired private security forces, essentially mercenary armies, to protect his facilities and intimidate resistors. He used his political connections to ensure that state militias crushed the Night Riders with maximum force, portraying the farmers not as victims of monopolistic exploitation, but as lawless criminals threatening the social order. Gradually, through superior resources and political influence, he prevailed. The Night Riders were arrested, their leaders imprisoned, their movement broken on the wheel of superior capital. The tobacco fields returned to an uneasy peace, but it was the peace of defeat, not resolution. Simultaneously, Duke faced a different species of resistance from an unexpected direction: progressive reformers who had begun to recognize that monopolies like his represented an existential threat to American democracy itself. The dawn of the progressive era brought journalists who viewed Duke not as an admirable entrepreneur, but as a predatory architect of dependency whose wealth rested on invisible wreckage. They dubbed him the Tobacco Demon and the Nicotine King, publishing expos that detailed his ruthless tactics and the human cost of his empire. Ida Tarbell, fresh from her dismantling of Standard Oil, turned her investigative gaze toward tobacco, documenting how Duke's Trust had strangled competition and manipulated prices with surgical precision. The political climate shifted like a tide turning. Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House, his Justice Department circling Duke's empire, like vultures sensing wounded prey. They had already trained their sights on Standard Oil and the railroad trusts, those other great leviathans of the Gilded Age. The logic of reform dictated that the tobacco trust must come under the same scrutiny, must face the same legal reckoning that awaited all who had grown too powerful for democracy to tolerate. Behind the closed doors of the Justice Department, lawyers assembled a case that treated the American Tobacco Company not as an admirable efficiency machine, but as a criminal conspiracy, an organized scheme to monopolize interstate commerce, crush rivals, and dictate terms to growers and retailers alike. They collected testimony from bankrupted competitors, bullied farmers, and coerced dealers. They traced the corporate labyrinth through shell companies and holding firms back to the same nexus: James B. Duke and his inner circle of lieutenants. In 1907, the blow finally fell. The federal government filed formal antitrust charges against the American Tobacco Company, accusing Duke and his associates of conspiracy to monopolize interstate commerce, restraint of trade, and the systematic elimination of competition. The indictment read like a catalog of everything Duke had accomplished, every tactic he had deployed, every competitor he had destroyed. The government was not merely challenging his business practices, it was challenging the entire structure of Gilded Age capitalism, using Duke as the test case for whether American democracy would tolerate the concentration of such vast economic power in the hands of a single man. Duke's initial response to the government's challenge was chilling in its arrogance. When informed of the federal case, he reportedly smiled with the weary confidence of a man who had never faced a defeat money could not soften. "Let them try," he said, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone addressing children playing at adult games. "I own the courts." It was not an idle boast. His political contributions had purchased influence at every level, from local judges to senators who owed their careers to his funding. He had navigated previous legal challenges with ease, using delays, appeals, and well-placed bribes to ensure that justice remained conveniently blind to his transgressions. But beneath his public bravado lay a miscalculation that even his vast intelligence network could not detect. The winds had shifted in ways his money could not control. The progressive movement had gained unstoppable momentum, fueled by public outrage at the excesses of robber barons and monopolists. Roosevelt, whatever his other flaws, possessed genuine contempt for concentrated corporate power and the political will to challenge it. The Supreme Court, while certainly influenced by wealth and politics, also contained men who recognized that allowing Duke's monopoly to stand would set a precedent that could unravel the entire framework of competitive capitalism. As the legal battle intensified through 1908, 1909, and 1910, Duke's facade of invincibility began to crack. He aged visibly under the pressure, the stress manifesting in a persistent cough that doctors attributed to nerves, but that Duke himself must have recognized as something more ominous. He had spent decades breathing factory smoke, testing his own products, living inside the addiction he had engineered for millions of Americans. The irony was beginning to assert itself with cruel precision. The man who had taught a nation to inhale was discovering that his own lungs were paying the price. Duke's response to the government's challenge was chilling. "Let them try. I own the courts." But the Tobacco King had miscalculated, because in 1911, the Supreme Court would deliver a verdict that shattered his empire and forced him to confront the only thing his fortune could never purchase: his own mortality. May 29, 1911. The Supreme Court of the United States. 9 justices. One verdict that would echo through American capitalism forever. The chamber existed in a perpetual state of cool solemnity, its marble columns rising like the pillars of a temple dedicated to the abstract deity of American justice. The morning had arrived with the oppressive humidity that transforms Washington into a swamp each summer, but inside these thick stone walls, the temperature remained controlled by institutional gravity and the weight of impending history. Light filtered through tall windows and measured shafts, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the air with the lazy certainty of fate itself, each particle suspended in the amber glow like evidence of time's relentless passage. The chamber filled with the architects of consequence, each arrival adding another layer to the morning's electric tension. Lawyers in morning coats adjusted their papers with hands that betrayed varying degrees of confidence or dread, their starched collars already beginning to wilt despite the cool air. These were not ordinary attorneys, but the finest legal minds that money could summon. Specialists from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia who had spent years constructing arguments designed to preserve or destroy the greatest industrial empire of the age. Reporters from every major newspaper leaned forward in the press gallery, fountain pens poised above notebooks like weapons ready for battle, understanding that the words they captured would become the headlines that defined this moment for posterity. In the public gallery, spectators who recognized they were witnessing the dissection of a titan settled into their seats with the hushed reverence normally reserved for cathedrals or execution chambers. Among them, occupying a seat that seemed somehow isolated despite being surrounded by others, sat James Buchanan Duke. At 45, the years of empire building had carved deep lines around his eyes and transformed the hungry look of his youth into something harder, more settled, the heavy gravity of immense power worn like an expensive coat. His hands remained folded in his lap with a composure that suggested either supreme confidence or the exhaustion of a man who had already accepted defeat and was simply waiting for the formality of its announcement. At precisely 10 o'clock, the 9 justices entered through heavy velvet curtains, their black robes creating the visual effect of shadows given human form. They took their seats behind the elevated bench with choreographed precision, each movement deliberate, each gesture weighted with the knowledge that what they were about to announce would reshape the architecture of American commerce. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, whose white beard gave him the appearance of a biblical prophet, surveyed the chamber with eyes that had witnessed the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the rise of industrial empires that now dwarfed the plantation economy of his youth. The air hung thick with anticipation and the weight of precedent. This was not merely a legal proceeding, but a referendum on the Gilded Age itself, a judgment on whether American democracy would tolerate the concentration of such vast economic power in the hands of a single man and his carefully constructed corporate labyrinth. The case had consumed 4 years of litigation, generated thousands of pages of testimony, and become a symbol of the broader struggle between progressive reformers who believed in regulated capitalism and the industrial titans who viewed government intervention as an existential threat to their dominion. Chief Justice White began to read the court's opinion in a voice that carried the measured cadence of someone announcing not merely a legal conclusion, but a historical inflection point. The language was dense with legal terminology and precedent, but the essential verdict emerged with devastating clarity as each sentence fell like a hammer blow against 20 years of empire building. The American Tobacco Company, the court declared, was not merely a successful business, but a criminal conspiracy that had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act through systematic monopolization of interstate commerce, restraint of trade, and the deliberate elimination of competition through tactics that the court described with unusual directness as predatory, ruthless, and antithetical to the principles of free enterprise. Guilty. The word hung in the air, heavy and final, settling over the chamber like smoke from a funeral pyre. 20 years of empire building. Over. The monopoly that Duke had constructed with mechanical precision and moral flexibility must be dismantled, broken into separate entities that would theoretically compete rather than collude. The court ordered the dissolution of the American Tobacco Company and its reorganization into 4 distinct corporations: a reconstituted American Tobacco Company, Liggett & Myers, Lorillard, and R.J. Reynolds. Each would operate independently, each would compete in the marketplace, and each would be forbidden from the coordinated price-fixing and market manipulation that had characterized the trust's reign. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos, reporters sprinting from their seats to telegraph their newspapers with the verdict that would dominate front pages from New York to San Francisco, lawyers whispering urgently to clients whose fortunes hung in the balance, clerks rushing to distribute copies of the opinion that would be studied in law schools for generations. Within hours, printing presses across America would spin out headlines in bold type: Duke Empire shattered, Tobacco Trust broken, Supreme Court orders dissolution of monopoly. The language would be triumphant, celebrating the victory of justice over greed, of democracy over oligarchy, of the people over the plutocrats. But James Buchanan Duke remained seated, stone-faced, his expression carved from the same marble that surrounded him. To the outside observer, this was the moment of ultimate defeat. His life's work, the colossal machine he had built from the red clay of North Carolina to the skyscrapers of Manhattan, had been legally murdered in front of him. His lawyers had promised victory with the confidence of those who believed that wealth could always find a path around principle. His money had purchased influence at every level of American politics, had funded campaigns and bought access to the highest offices in the land. His network of political connections had seemed impregnable, a fortress built on favors owed and debts called in. And yet, he had lost. The devastating irony of the moment should have crushed him. His lawyers, the finest legal minds that money could purchase, shuffled their papers in stunned silence. His influence, which had reached into both major political parties, to senators and governors whose campaigns had been quietly watered by his capital, had failed to prevent this moment of reckoning. The American Tobacco Company, his masterpiece, was being legally murdered before his eyes. But here lies the twist that most historians miss, the detail that transforms this apparent defeat into something far more complex and unsettling. James Duke didn't care. Or rather, he cared only in the way that a chess master cares when forced to sacrifice a piece in service of a larger strategy that his opponents cannot yet perceive. The breakup of his monopoly did not destroy his wealth. It multiplied it in ways that even the most cynical observers failed to anticipate. The court's order required the dissolution of the corporate structure, but it could not, indeed legally could not, confiscate Duke's personal holdings. He retained controlling shares in all 4 successor companies, his fortune now distributed across multiple entities rather than concentrated in one. The intended punishment became an unexpected windfall of staggering proportions. Stock prices, which many had predicted would collapse under the weight of uncertainty and forced reorganization, instead soared as investors recognized that 4 competing tobacco companies operating under clear legal guidelines would generate more combined profit than one monopoly operating. Under constant legal siege, the market valued certainty over dominion, and the court's decision provided exactly that, a clear path forward, free from the shadow of perpetual litigation. Duke emerged from the dissolution process not merely intact, but enriched beyond his wildest calculations. His net worth, already staggering by the standards of the era, increased substantially as the successor companies thrived in their new configurations. The punishment had made him richer than ever. Yet something essential did break inside James Buchanan Duke on that humid May morning in 1911. Something that wealth could neither repair nor replace. Perhaps it was the simple arithmetic of age. He was no longer the hungry, desperate boy from Durham who had hitched himself to a plow because his family could not afford a mule. The fire that had driven him to build an empire with such single-minded ruthlessness had begun to cool, replaced by something that resembled not regret, but a profound exhaustion that came from having won every battle that mattered in economic terms while losing the war for the kind of immortality that transcends mere accumulation. Perhaps it was the realization, arriving with the force of revelation, that empires are temporary regardless of how vast they grow, that all human construction eventually crumbles into the same dust. He had built something that seemed permanent, a machine that would outlive him by generations, only to watch it legally dismembered by 9 men in black robes who cared nothing for his vision or his will. The illusion of permanence had shattered, revealing the fragile contingency beneath all human achievement. Or perhaps, and this seems most likely given what followed, it was the cough. The persistent, rattling cough that had begun in 1910 and never stopped, that woke him in the night and followed him through his days like an uninvited companion. As he walked away from the courthouse that day, observers might have noticed a slight hesitation in his step, a subtle weakness that had not been there a decade earlier. This was the cough of a man who had spent 40 years breathing factory smoke, testing his own products with the voracious appetite of a man proving their safety to a skeptical world, living inside the addiction he had engineered for millions of Americans. His lungs, those delicate organs that had processed decades of tobacco dust and chemical residue, were beginning to fail with the slow, inexorable progression of damage that no amount of capital could reverse. The irony was devastating in its precision. The man who had taught America to inhale was discovering that his own breath was becoming a luxury he could no longer afford. Duke had spent his life proving that money could purchase almost anything: political influence, legal victories, social status, even the transformation of public opinion through carefully orchestrated campaigns. But money could not purchase health once it had been squandered, could not rebuild lung tissue scarred by industrial exposure, could not add years to a life that had been lived at maximum intensity without regard for physical consequences. In the months following the Supreme Court decision, Duke began to withdraw from the daily operations of his fragmenting empire, delegating responsibilities to lieutenants who had learned their ruthlessness at his knee. He spent less time in boardrooms and more time at his estates, surrounded by architects and landscape designers rather than lawyers and accountants. His correspondence from this period reveals a man grappling with questions that wealth cannot answer, questions about legacy, about how history would remember him, about whether the monuments he might build could outweigh the damage he had inflicted. He had conquered an industry, addicted a nation, accumulated a fortune that rivaled those of Rockefeller and Carnegie. But what had he built that would outlast the cough, that would transform his name from a synonym for predatory capitalism into something resembling nobility? The answer, when it came, would be as calculated as everything else in his life. He would purchase redemption through the oldest alchemy known to the wealthy, strategic philanthropy that builds institutions bearing the donor's name. The government believed they had slain the dragon. In reality, they had simply severed one head, allowing 4 more to grow in its place. But James Duke was already planning his final transformation, from robber baron to philanthropist, from predator to saint. The red clay soil of his childhood stretches before him, transformed by his fortune into something resembling a construction site for the divine. Where tobacco barns once sagged under the weight of curing leaves, Gothic spires now rise toward the Carolina sky, with architectural ambition that seems almost defiant in its grandeur. Stone masons imported from Europe chisel limestone into gargoyles and flying buttresses, creating a cathedral to learning that would not look out of place at Oxford or Cambridge. The irony is almost too perfect to be accidental. The man who built his empire on addiction is now constructing monuments to enlightenment on the same soil where his father once scraped together survival from tobacco and desperation. Duke stands at the edge of this transformation, aged beyond his 58 years, his frame diminished by illness that he refuses to acknowledge publicly, but that has become impossible to ignore privately. The persistent cough that began as an occasional irritation has evolved into a constant companion. A rattling reminder that even emperors remain subject to biology. He watches the construction with eyes that have lost none of their calculating precision, but have gained something else. A desperate urgency born from the recognition that time, the one commodity he cannot purchase in bulk, is running out. The scale of his philanthropic transformation defies comprehension even by Gilded Age standards, where robber barons routinely attempted to purchase posthumous respectability through strategic generosity. On December 11, 1924, in a carefully orchestrated ceremony, Duke signs the instrument that will outlive him more effectively than any factory tower or corporate charter, the Duke Endowment. He pledges $40 million, an amount that staggers contemporaries, equivalent to over $600 million today, to a charitable trust that will fund education, hospitals, orphanages, and churches across the Carolinas. It represents the largest philanthropic act in Southern history, a financial earthquake whose aftershocks will ripple through the region for generations. The transformation of Trinity College into Duke University becomes his most visible monument, a Gothic fantasy rising from Carolina soil, with resources that dwarf those of most established Northern institutions. he pours millions into construction, demanding architecture that speaks of permanence and prestige, limestone buildings modeled after Princeton and Yale. A chapel whose bell tower will dominate the Durham skyline for generations. Dormitories and libraries and laboratories equipped with the finest instruments money can procure. The campus will eventually encompass over 8,000 acres, a physical empire replacing the commercial one that was legally dismantled. Duke hospitals begin appearing across the Carolinas, gleaming institutions of white tile and modern equipment that bring sophisticated medical care to regions that had never seen such resources. The paradox seems almost intentionally constructed. The man whose product damages lungs funds institutions dedicated to repairing them. His endowment flows into orphanages with neat lawns and sympathetic matrons, rural Methodist churches where his name will be invoked from pulpits for decades, and pensions for retired preachers who spent their lives serving congregations too poor to provide for their old age. But beneath this avalanche of strategic generosity lies a question that Duke himself never publicly addresses, though it must have haunted his final years with increasing insistence. Can blood money be laundered through charity? Can a fortune built on engineered addiction be transformed into moral legitimacy through the alchemy of institutional philanthropy? Can stone and glass and endowments erase the human cost of the empire that paid for them? By 1925, the evidence of that cost has become impossible to ignore for anyone willing to look. Medical studies, still primitive by later standards but increasingly difficult to dismiss, begin establishing statistical correlations between cigarette smoking and respiratory disease. Physicians notice patterns among their patients that coincidence can no longer explain. Factory workers who spent decades in Duke's plants, breathing air thick with tobacco dust and chemical additives, arrive at clinics coughing up dark phlegm, their chests tight, their lungs crackling under the stethoscope. Men who smoked his brands by the packet, soldiers who received free samples in khaki uniforms, clerks who leaned on counters with cigarettes between their fingers, machinists who lit up at every break, begin to present with chronic bronchitis, heart strain, and the ominous shadows on X-rays that will later be labeled tumors. Veterans of the Great War, men who received Duke's free samples in the trenches of France, now fill veterans' hospitals, coughing blood from lungs ravaged not by mustard gas, but by the steady accumulation of tar. In crowded boarding houses and rural shacks, men in their 40s wheeze like old men, their nights interrupted by spasms of coughing that leave them clutching bed frames for support. The data are still embryonic, easily dismissed by those with reasons to ignore them, but the human toll speaks with increasing volume. Duke ignores it all, with the selective blindness of a man whose fortune depends on not seeing. When questioned by journalists about emerging health concerns, he deploys the same response he has perfected over decades, a dismissive smile, followed by personal testimony that functions as both shield and sword. "I've smoked every day for 40 years, he says, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience, often while holding a lit cigarette. "I'm fine." The lie is so confident that even he might believe it in moments when the cough subsides long enough to allow self-deception. But he is not fine. His private physicians, sworn to confidentiality but unable to lie to their patient, deliver diagnoses that grow progressively grimmer. His lungs, scarred by decades of exposure to the very product he perfected, are failing with the slow inevitability of a machine wearing out its essential components. The treatments available in 1925, rest, fresh air, perhaps a winter in warmer climates, offer comfort but not cure. The irony is devastating in its precision. The benefactor who is building hospitals to heal the sick is dying from the very habit he popularized, funding research into medicine, while his own body succumbs to the consequences of his industrial genius. The personal dimension of his final years carries its own particular desolation. Duke has no male heirs to inherit his industrial legacy, no son groomed to continue the dynasty he built from dirt floor poverty. His only child, daughter Doris, will inherit a fortune so vast it will define and distort her entire life, becoming the richest girl in the world. But she cannot inherit the empire itself, his ruthless instinct for domination, or the complex burden of his history. His marriages, 2 of them, were transactions that produced wealth consolidation and social advancement, but little warmth. His final years are spent not with family gathered in affectionate proximity, but with lawyers who draft increasingly complex trusts, architects who present blueprints for buildings he will never see completed, and university administrators who nod enthusiastically at his vision while calculating how much more they might extract from his guilt-driven generosity. He seeks to purchase redemption in stone, glass, and endowments, constructing a legacy that will outlive the cough and transform his reputation from predator to benefactor. He is consumed by the details of his endowment, obsessing over trust indentures and architectural plans with the same intensity he once applied to cigarette manufacturing. The immediate fallout from Duke's philanthropic transformation creates a complex moral landscape across the South that reveals the arbitrary nature of fortune in monopoly capitalism. Former competitors who sold their companies to the trust during its expansion years experienced divergent fates. Some, like the principals of Allen and Ginter, parlayed their buyout payments into comfortable retirements and diversified investments, their names fading into historical footnotes, while their families enjoyed wealth without the burden of continued industrial warfare. Others, particularly smaller manufacturers who held out against Duke's pressure until bankruptcy forced capitulation, received pennies on the dollar for businesses that represented generational accumulation, their bitterness unassuaged by Duke's later philanthropy. The workers who built Duke's empire with their hands and lungs occupy an even more ambiguous position in this moral ledger. They gained wages that, while modest by Duke's standards, exceeded what agricultural labor would have provided in the post-Reconstruction South. They gained access to better hospitals funded by his endowment, but they lost health in ways that would only become statistically visible decades later, their lungs scarred by industrial exposure, their life expectancies shortened by years of breathing air thick with tobacco dust and chemical additives. The transaction, wages for health, seemed reasonable in the moment but revealed its cruelty only in retrospect. Anti-tobacco reformers, a small but vocal minority in the 1920s, watched Duke's philanthropic transformation with a frustration bordering on despair. They had spent years documenting the health risks of cigarette smoking, publishing studies that suggested correlations between tobacco use and respiratory disease, warning that Duke's empire was built on engineered addiction. Their warnings were dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of killjoys, while Duke's buildings rose as monuments to respectability, his name carved in limestone above doorways through which future generations would pass, without knowing or caring about the source of their institution's wealth. Duke's charitable trust is designed with the same structural genius as his monopoly, self-perpetuating, influential, and inextricably linked to the economic health of the region. By funding rural churches and hospitals, he ensures that his name will be spoken with reverence in communities that might otherwise have resented his wealth. He weaves his legacy into the fabric of Southern society so tightly that to criticize Duke becomes tantamount to criticizing the institutions that sustain the community. He has not just bought respectability. He has engineered it with the same systematic precision he once applied to market domination. As 1925 draws to a close, the final reckoning arrives with the grim inevitability of a Greek tragedy whose ending has been visible from the opening act. By early December, his physicians inform him that his lungs are beyond saving, that the damage accumulated over decades has progressed beyond any treatment available to medical science. Pneumonia sets in like a final, opportunistic creditor, finding fertile ground in lungs weakened by 40 years of breathing factory smoke and testing his own products. He has days, perhaps hours, before respiratory failure completes its work. Duke receives the news in his Fifth Avenue mansion with the same stoic calculation that defined his life. He does not spend his final conscious hours seeking forgiveness from those he crushed or saying tender goodbyes to loved ones. Instead, he summons his lawyers. He spends his dying hours not with family, but dictating final revisions to his will, ensuring that 90% of his remaining fortune, a sum so vast it strains comprehension, flows into charitable trusts bearing his name. His instructions are precise, calculated to maximize the philanthropic impact that will define his posthumous reputation. The will is a masterpiece of strategic generosity, each bequest carefully calibrated to build institutions that will speak his name with reverence for generations. Duke University will receive the largest share, ensuring that thousands of students will pass through buildings bearing his name, their education funded by tobacco profits transformed through philanthropic alchemy into something resembling virtue. Hospitals will heal bodies damaged by products his factories perfected. Churches will preach sermons in sanctuaries his money built. He is betting everything that the monuments will outlast the memories, that the stone will speak louder than the smoke. He would be remembered not as the tobacco king, the ruthless monopolist who destroyed competitors and addicted a nation, but as the great benefactor, the visionary philanthropist, who built a university in the Pines and healed the sick across the Carolinas. On December 10, 1925, Duke's physician informed him his lungs were beyond saving. He had days, perhaps hours. Duke spent his final moments not with loved ones, but dictating his will, 90% of his fortune to charitable trusts. He would be remembered not as the tobacco king, but as the great benefactor. At 1:35 a.m., James Buchanan Duke took his last breath, the same breath he had stolen from millions. Today, Duke University stands among America's most prestigious institutions. Its hospitals save thousands annually. Its research advances medicine, technology, law. Students traverse Gothic quadrangles beneath limestone arches, clutching laptops and coffee cups, passing the bronze statue of a man in a three-piece suit whose name adorns their diplomas, but whose story remains carefully obscured. They know this place simply as Duke, as if the word were an abstract sound rather than the surname of a man who once measured human craving in units of profit. And yet, every building, every scholarship, every brick was purchased with a product that has killed over 100 million people worldwide since James Duke's death. The campus itself functions as a monument to the power of strategic generosity to rewrite history, its endowment swelling into the billions while placing it among the wealthiest academies on Earth. Duke University consistently ranks among the top research institutions globally, its medical center pioneering treatments that extend lives, its law school producing jurists who shape policy, its engineering programs advancing technologies that define modernity. The good accomplished under Duke's name is real, measurable, and undeniable. Cancer patients receive cutting-edge treatment in Duke hospitals, the profound irony apparently lost on administrators who never mention that the endowment funding their research was built on a product that causes the very cancers they treat. The American Tobacco Company, the Leviathan Duke forged with such ruthless precision, no longer exists as a legal entity. The Supreme Court's 1911 dissolution order accomplished its stated purpose of breaking the monopoly into competing fragments. But Duke did not merely build a company. He constructed a system, a blueprint for addiction that proved far more durable than any corporation. His empire did not die, but simply evolved, adapting to new legal constraints with the same flexibility that characterized his original rise. The descendants of his monopoly, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, British American Tobacco, Lorillard, now bestride not merely a nation but the globe, generating over $500 billion in annual revenue, a sum so vast it dwarfs Duke's personal fortune at its peak, while employing the exact playbook he wrote in the 1880s. Duke's true legacy lies not in any specific company, but in the techniques he pioneered, the systematic transformation of human weakness into industrial profit. His advertising innovations became the foundation of modern consumer capitalism with devastating precision. Celebrity endorsements that associate products with aspiration, collectible cards that transform consumption into compulsion, targeted marketing that identifies vulnerable populations and exploits their psychological vulnerabilities, every advertisement that uses a famous face to sell a product, every loyalty program that rewards repeat purchases, every marketing campaign that targets children or women with messages calibrated to their specific insecurities traces its lineage directly to Duke's factories in Durham. When you see a sleek advertisement implying that a product will make you cooler, richer, or more sophisticated, you are looking at Duke's ghost. His understanding that desire could be manufactured with the same efficiency as any industrial product. Business schools now teach monopoly tactics as case studies in strategic ruthlessness, often with a tone of admiration barely disguised as academic neutrality. Vertical integration, predatory pricing, regulatory capture, these practices, once described in horrified tones by progressive reformers, are now analyzed as brilliant efficiency rather than predatory consolidation. Students with bright futures and clean consciences study Duke's methods with analytic detachment, admiring the strategic brilliance without inhaling the bitter smoke that accompanied its execution. The moral dimension of these tactics, the human cost of their implementation, is relegated to footnotes or ignored entirely in favor of celebrating their effectiveness. The global reach of Duke's system has produced a death toll that staggers comprehension. Since his death in 1925, cigarette smoking has killed over 100 million people worldwide, more than both world wars combined, more than the plague, more than any single product or invention in human history. The number continues to grow by approximately 8 million annually, a holocaust conducted in slow motion, one cigarette at a time, one breath at a time, normalized to the point of invisibility by its very ubiquity. The descendants of Duke's empire continue to innovate, adapting his techniques to new markets and new products. E-cigarettes and vaping devices represent the latest evolution of his fundamental insight that if you can engineer a delivery system for nicotine that appears modern, sophisticated, and less harmful than its predecessors, you can addict a new generation before they fully understand the transaction. They're entering. James Duke did not invent cigarettes, but he invented the cigarette industry, transforming a niche product into a mass addiction through the systematic application of industrial machinery, psychological manipulation, and economic coercion. He transformed luxury into necessity through the simple mechanism of engineered dependency. He transformed choice into compulsion by understanding that nicotine rewires the brain's reward pathways, creating a biological dependency that makes choice a philosophical abstraction rather than a practical reality. He transformed a product into a pandemic, his innovations spreading across the globe until cigarette smoking became one of the leading causes of preventable death worldwide. And he accomplished this transformation while convincing substantial portions of the world that he was a hero, a benefactor, a visionary who built universities and healed the sick. This is the paradox of the Gilded Age that extends far beyond Duke himself. The men who built America also poisoned it. The fortunes that fund our greatest institutions, that endow our universities and museums and hospitals, were extracted from our greatest weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Duke understood what most refuse to accept, even today. Morality and power are not opposites, but accomplices. The same ruthlessness that allowed him to destroy competitors, manipulate markets, and addict millions also enabled him to accumulate the capital necessary for transformative philanthropy. Virtue and vice in his life were not competing forces, but complementary tools employed toward the single objective of dominion, first over markets, then over memory. Money, when accumulated in sufficient quantities and laundered through philanthropic institutions, acquires a kind of moral neutrality that allows society to accept the good it funds without interrogating the evil that produced it. The haunting quality of Duke's legacy lies in its persistence, its refusal to be neatly categorized or dismissed. He built universities to outlive his sins, funded hospitals to heal damage his products caused, carved his name in marble so history would forget the cough, the rattling, fluid-filled cough that stalked him to his grave. He tried to purchase redemption with the same frantic energy he used to buy competitors, believing that if the buildings were tall enough, if the endowments were large enough, the smoke would eventually clear. But the smoke remembers. It always does. It hangs in lung cancer wards across America, where patients hooked to oxygen tanks wheeze through damaged airways, their bodies testaments to the long-term consequences of the addiction Duke industrialized. On memorial walls listing those who died from smoking-related illness, names accumulate year after year, a roster of casualties from a war most never realized they were fighting. It drifts through the boardrooms of his corporate descendants, where executives still calculate the precise legal cost of a human life. In tobacco fields across North Carolina, the same bright-leaf tobacco that funded Duke's rise still grows, still gets harvested, still feeds into supply chains that produce over 5 trillion cigarettes annually worldwide. The ghost of James Buchanan Duke does not haunt a mansion, it haunts the lungs of the world. The true genius of Duke was not in the machinery of production, but in the machinery of denial. He created a world where the connection between the product and the consequence was severed, where the pleasure was immediate and the cost was deferred, exploiting a glitch in human psychology and monetizing our vulnerability to long-term risk on a scale that defies comprehension. He proved that if you can make a product part of a person's identity, part of their daily ritual, part of how they cope with the world, they will defend it, and you to their death. Every time someone lights a cigarette, whether in a Durham alley where Duke's factories once stood, in a Manhattan penthouse overlooking the city he conquered, in a trench in Ukraine, or a nightclub in Tokyo, they participate in James Duke's final eternal transaction, your breath for his. Immortality. The exchange is rarely conscious or understood as such. The smoker believes they are purchasing a moment of relief, a brief escape from stress, a social lubricant, a gesture of rebellion or sophistication. What they are actually purchasing is their participation in a system designed over a century ago by a man who understood that addiction is the ultimate form of customer loyalty, that dependency creates markets more reliable than any brand affinity or product quality. The man died in 1925, his lungs finally succumbing to the same product that built his fortune, his final breath a mirror of the millions he had stolen through engineered addiction. But the system he designed is immortal, evolving and adapting with each generation, finding new markets and new victims, generating profits that dwarf his personal fortune while maintaining the essential architecture he constructed. It is a self-perpetuating engine of capital and craving that requires no operator, only fuel. And we are the fuel. And in that immortality lies a truth about American capitalism that we still refuse to confront, a truth that stares back at us from the Gothic arches of Duke University and the sterile quiet of the cancer ward. The line between innovation and exploitation, between progress and poison, between benefactor and predator, is often invisible, drawn in smoke that never truly clears. We live in the world James Duke built, breathing the air he shaped, walking past the monuments he purchased with the slow, invisible ruin of breath. He bought his way into heaven with the profits of hell, proving that in America you can commit any sin, inflict any damage, destroy any number of lives, as long as you leave behind a big enough endowment. The smoke from his factories, from his cigarettes, from the system he built, rises and disperses but never fully disappears, hanging in the air like a question that American capitalism has spent a century avoiding, whether the monuments built on mass suffering can ever truly absolve there. Architects, or whether they simply prove that we have learned to profit from our own poisoning and call it progress.